The late afternoon at the community bank had all the earmarks of a well-practiced symphony. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the steady whir of printers, while hushed conversations and polite greetings filled the air. Behind the counters, staff moved with the smooth precision of a rehearsed ballet, their smiles as habitual as the chime of the lobby door. It was on such an ordinary day that an unexpected note disrupted the routine. Without warning, the heavy glass doors swung open and a man entered, a black man in his late 40s whose appearance defied the usual script. He wore a simple hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that bore the marks of many roads traveled. His presence was understated yet magnetic, a calm stride, a slight tilt of his head as if savoring the scene, and a demeanor that suggested he carried stories beneath his quiet exterior. Without announcing himself, he settled into a chair in the waiting area, his gaze fixed on the glow of his phone. Linda Pearson, the branch manager, was deeply absorbed in a stack of loan applications and the minutiae of financial statements. Her world of numbers and routine approvals was suddenly disturbed by the sight of this solitary figure lingering in a space that normally buzzed with purposeful activity. For the first few minutes, his silence was just another background note, but as time trickled by and the usual bustle swelled around him, customers arriving and departing, tellers chattering softly, an unsettling dissonance began to echo in Linda's mind. Who is he? She wondered, her intuition prickling with an inexplicable alarm. His posture was unhurried, his demeanor almost too relaxed for someone who might need urgent assistance. Linda exchanged a furtive glance with Greg, a young teller whose curiosity mirrored her own. "Do you recognize him?" she asked in a hushed tone. Greg shook his head, mumbling something about him possibly waiting for an acquaintance. Yet, to Linda, the scene felt contrived, a performance of deliberate inaction in a place defined by its structured rhythms. As minutes passed, Linda's unease grew into a tangible tension. He had sat there for nearly 20 minutes, untouched by the usual stream of routine transactions. His phone remained his sole companion, he had neither a checkbook nor a deposit slip to his name. The quiet scrutiny in Linda's mind began to resemble a premonition, a subtle warning that something was amiss. Unable to shake the feeling, she reached for her phone and, with a trembling certainty, dialed the emergency services. "Hello, this is Linda Pearson at the community bank," she said, her voice tight as she described a suspicious individual who had been idly occupying the lobby for an unusual length of time. She detailed his appearance in soft, controlled tones, careful to include every nuance that had unsettled her, the hoodie, the jeans, the unhurried scroll of his phone. Even as she spoke, a shadow of doubt danced in her mind, a question of whether she was interpreting the quiet scene through a lens tinted by assumptions. Almost immediately, the bank's atmosphere shifted. Outside, the flash of blue and red lights spilled through the glass entrance, and two officers strode in. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a stern, measured gaze, the other, a younger black officer whose eyes were still unjaded by years on the force. Their presence sent a ripple of whispered alarm through the room, conversations dropped to murmurs and even the hum of the printer seemed to falter. The officers approached the man calmly yet purposefully. For a moment, the quiet murmur of the bank was replaced by a heavy, anticipatory silence. The stranger's eyes flickered toward Linda, a brief, almost imperceptible meeting of glances, before he returned his attention to his phone, his expression unreadable. "Sir, may we have a word?" the taller officer requested in a tone that mingled formality with a hint of inquiry. The man blinked slowly, then set his phone aside with a deliberate calm. From beneath the officer's measured gaze, a tension built as he reached into his pocket and produced a worn leather wallet. With deliberate precision, he flipped it open and offered a driver's license. The older officer scrutinized the ID, his brows knitting in confusion before an unexpected revelation struck him. In a clipped, almost incredulous tone, he murmured, "Mr. Taylor, you own this bank." The words hung in the air like a discordant chord, and the world seemed to still. Around the counter, time suspended. Greg's fingers froze above the register, and even the murmurs of the waiting customers dwindled into stunned silence. Linda's heart hammered in her chest as realization cascaded over her. She had called the police on the very man who held the reins of this institution. Mr. Taylor's face remained impassive, yet his eyes shone with a weariness that hinted at many past injustices. "Can we talk for a moment?" the tall officer said, though his tone now carried a trace of discomfort. Taylor's measured reply was calm, yet edged with a quiet challenge. "At what point did I become a threat?" His voice was steady, his words carrying the weight of both authority and unspoken sorrow. Linda's throat constricted as she struggled for words. I just thought," she stammered, her voice losing its firmness as the implications of her actions sank in. Across the room, even the white couple waiting near the teller's window exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions reflecting a collective, dawning realization. The security guard by the entrance straightened, as if bracing himself for the unfolding drama. The conversation grew more strained. Taylor's eyes narrowed just a fraction as he continued, "Did you assume I didn't belong here, simply because I dressed differently? Because I sat quietly while everyone else rushed to the counter?" His tone was not angry, but it carried a cutting clarity that made every listener lean in a little closer. The younger officer shifted, his gaze flitting uncertainly between Linda and his partner, as if silently questioning the wisdom of the call that had brought them here. Linda's face burned with humiliation as she fumbled for an explanation. I wasn't expecting anyone like you here," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, laden with regret. "I didn't know." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft, uneasy shuffling of footsteps and the distant hum of machinery. Then, as if the tension could not be heightened further, the door creaked open once more. In strode Amanda Rivers, a regional executive known for her sharp acumen and no-nonsense demeanor. Her eyes swept over the scene with the cool detachment of someone used to enforcing order, yet there was a glint, perhaps of disappointment, in her gaze as she zeroed in on Greg, who had just muttered under his breath about the necessity of the call. Amanda's presence deepened the sense of inevitability. Everyone in the bank felt the weight of impending consequences. "Where is Mr. Taylor?" Amanda inquired briskly, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. Greg straightened in his seat, his earlier nonchalance replaced by a rigid formality as he hurried to provide an answer. Linda felt the air tighten around her, each second a reminder of the irreversible mistake she had made. In the ensuing minutes, the bank's customary rhythm was irrevocably altered. Conversations fell silent, eyes darted away from Linda's trembling form, and every whispered remark seemed to echo her internal collapse. The officers, having completed their routine check, retreated with subdued apologies and awkward glances, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and introspection. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the day's activity dwindled, Linda found herself alone in the parking lot. Seated in her car with the engine silent, she replayed the day's events in her mind, the moment she first saw Mr. Taylor, the decision to dial 911, and the crushing revelation of his true identity. The steady rhythm of her breath contrasted sharply with the storm of regret swirling within her. In the stillness of that moment, memories long suppressed surfaced, a flashback to her early years as a teenager working at a modest grocery store, where a manager had cautioned her about certain types of customers. Back then, she had followed orders without question. Now, confronted with the reality of her actions, she wondered if those early lessons had sown seeds of an unconscious bias she never dared to question. Her hands, still shaking, reached for her phone, and before she knew it, she was scrolling through articles and studies on implicit bias in the workplace, each headline a mirror reflecting a truth she had long ignored. The next day brought no immediate resolution. Linda was summoned to a meeting in a sleek, modern office that belonged to none other than Mr. Taylor himself. The room was understated but immaculate, a polished desk, a few tastefully framed photographs, and a panoramic window that offered a view of the bustling street below. Taylor sat behind the desk with his arms folded, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was both penetrating and sorrowful. "Linda," he began quietly, "tell me, when you saw me here, did you believe I was lost, dangerous, or somehow out of place?" His voice was smooth, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of both disappointment and a plea for understanding. For a long, suffocating moment, Linda could only stare at the floor. Finally, she managed to whisper, I assumed. I don't know what I assumed." Her voice wavered, laden with regret and confusion. Taylor leaned forward, his expression softening just slightly. "I built this bank on trust, on community. I've invested not only money but my very soul in making this place a haven for all. And yet, today, I witnessed something that makes me question whether we truly live up to that ideal." His words were gentle, yet every syllable cut through her like shards of ice. A heavy silence followed, filled only by the quiet hum of distant traffic. "I'm not here to ruin your life," Taylor continued, "but I need you to understand the magnitude of your actions. Calling the police on a person simply for the way he looks, for the way he sits, is a mistake that reverberates far beyond a single moment." His eyes searched hers, urging her to confront a painful truth. Tears threatened to spill from Linda's eyes as she tried to form a response, but Taylor's next words came with a finality that left no room for negotiation. Today, you will be placed on unpaid leave. I need time to think about whether you still embody the values this bank stands for. I trusted you, Linda, and now I must question if that trust was misplaced. The words hung in the air, a verdict delivered not with anger but with a measured, sorrowful disappointment. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she nodded numbly, her mind racing with a mix of shame, regret, and the dawning realization of her own complicity in a system that she had once believed was fair. After the meeting, as Linda trudged back into the waning light of the empty bank, the corridors seemed to whisper silent admonishments. Each step felt heavier than the last, burdened by the knowledge that a single misjudgment had not only marred a day but had also cast a long shadow over 15 years of dedication and service. Outside, the world moved on as usual, but within Linda, a storm was brewing, a tempest of self-doubt and introspection. She found herself haunted by questions that she had never dared to ask. Was she really the fair and reasonable person she thought herself to be? Had she been blind to the subtle cues that led to a call that, in hindsight, was born of prejudice rather than caution? In the quiet of her car that evening, as the engine idled and darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, Linda's trembling fingers began typing out a search query: unconscious bias in the workplace. The screen filled with articles, studies, and personal testimonies, a mosaic of voices acknowledging that bias, subtle and often unintentional, can lurk in the most unassuming corners of our lives. Each story resonated with her own experience, forcing her to confront a truth that was as bitter as it was inevitable: being a good person was not enough if one failed to see the blind spots in one's own heart. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, and with it came a resolve to change, a promise to look inward and question the ingrained assumptions that had led her astray. In that moment, Linda understood that the path to redemption was paved not with excuses but with honest introspection and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. And so, as the night deepened and the hum of the city became a distant murmur, Linda sat quietly in her car, the events of the day swirling in her mind like fragments of a shattered mirror. The incident at the bank was not merely an isolated mistake, it was a call to action, a prompt to all who believed in fairness to examine the biases hidden in plain sight. If there's one lesson to be drawn from this ordeal, it is that our assumptions, born of habit and unchecked by self-awareness, can lead us down paths that harm not only others but also the very communities we strive to serve. In a world where even the smallest moment of oversight can spiral into a crisis of trust, it is imperative to pause and ask, what does it truly mean to belong? How do we ensure that our actions reflect not just caution, but compassion and equity? Perhaps, in this shared moment of reckoning, there is a chance for all of us to learn, to grow, and to rebuild the bridges that divide us. As you reflect on this story, consider its quiet urgency, a plea for introspection and change. Because sometimes, the most profound lessons are learned in the silence after the storm. If this narrative has stirred something within you, if it has prompted you to examine your own assumptions and biases, then take a moment to share in the conversation. Subscribe for more reflections and discussions that challenge us all to become better, more aware stewards of our communities. After all, it is in these uncomfortable questions and honest dialogues that true transformation begins.